Thank you, Adley. I'm delighted to be here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Coming to talk about Ted's collection it's like walking through a library or an archive and seeing the treasures of the past, because Ted has really accumulated quite a collection. I'm sure you've seen the catalog. That's a marvelous summary of part of his collection. I got an email last week from Caroline Schimmel, who was in charge of, I think, 3 or 4 of the Streeter sales back in the 60s. And she said, this takes me right back to those Streeter sales. This is an important event, it's an important collection, and Ted has just done a marvelous job of bringing it together. It's not something, however, that happened overnight. As he explained, he's been at this for more than 40 years. This is an article that appeared in Heritage Magazine in 2003, 20 years ago, talking about the items in his collection. And he has not been hiding his collection under a bushel either. He's been sharing it with people. He's loaned it, and many people have seen parts of his collection. And Francis told me before we began that when he brought this material to be auctioned, that it looked like nothing had left your house. There were no holes in the collection after this was gone. So there's more to come. More. Well, Ted has presented it in a chronological manner. This is the first map that showed the coastline of Texas. Doesn't show Texas, but it certainly shows the coastline. I myself am much more interested in pictures, so I have sort of scanned the collection to look at the pictures and find something that I can talk about in reality. And this is one of the earliest pictures that purports to be a Texas scene. This is, of course, the Nicholas Dufour map, and the detail in the cartouche shows LaSalle being murdered in the East Texas wilderness somewhere. Of course, we don't know where that took place, but that was LaSalle trying to get from the Texas coast back to the Mississippi River, and of course never made it. It was an imaginary scene, of course. No artists were in Texas at that time, and Texas was really kind of quiet as far as the frontier is concerned at that time. Texas really didn't burst on the scene until early in the 19th century, when a group of about 150 Frenchmen established a colony near Liberty, Texas on the Trinity River called Champ d'Asile. These were refugees from Napoleon's defeated army because they were not permitted to work in France anywhere but on the family farm. So they had to find something else to do. They came to Texas and were trying to establish a settlement in Texas. Some people say they were trying to establish really a beachhead so they could go into Mexico and get the silver mines. But quite a bit of material appeared in France about the colony because it became a cause célèbre. The anti-monarchists said, look what you have done to our loyal troops. You forced them to immigrate to the frontier. Well, quite a bit of material appeared in France on this colony. And you'll see this in the exhibition outside. This is the Hartman and Millard book on the colony. Hartman and Millard were there. There are 2 sort of diaries presented in this book. And the frontispiece to the book, or the fold-out, is this map. And the map is numbered, and there are identifications on the map. For example, if you can, I can't see that, but number 1 down there is General Lallemand's house. So they're numbered and they're all identified. This is a map of the Champ d'Asile colony. When they found out that there was a Spanish army coming to drive them out, they actually decamped in about 2 hours and left. They went back to Galveston and then to New Orleans, and they dispersed. And by the time the Spanish army got there, the captain said he was really glad that they had left, because he said this fortification was put together according to all the rules, and it would have been very difficult to attack them. It would have been very difficult to defeat them in the place that they had chosen. And this, of course, right here represents the Trinity River. Well, shortly after Jean d'Azille dispersed, 1821, Stephen F. Austin began coming into Texas and establishing his colony. And shortly after he did, his cousin, Mary Austin Holly, came to visit. And with his help, she wrote a book. And it's the first book that is completely on Texas in English. And she describes what you would find in Texas. It's a book that she was trying to help Austin with immigration. She talks about the birds of Texas, for example. And she said, the birds in Texas are what you see in the rest of the country. If Audubon had read that book, he might not have come to Texas in 1837 when he did. He would have known that there were no new birds in Texas. He had seen them all up and down the Mississippi River and in Louisiana. But it's the first complete book on Texas by Mary Austin Holly, and it's a fine item. I am partial to pictures, as I mentioned, and this may be the first eyewitness drawings of Texas. This is a book published in 1834, A Visit to Texas. The author is anonymous. We don't know for sure who the author was, and we don't know who the artist was either. But we see various scenes. Hunters in the upper left. In the center, Mr. McNeil's place with his pasture spreading out. On the right, what may be the first picture of a Texas vaquero or a cowboy. And at this point, they're going through the cane brakes in East Texas. And that one stretches my imagination quite a bit as far as what the cane brakes might have looked like. But East Texas was a wilderness at that time, and that certainly emphasizes that point. And there's, of course, a delightful map in the book as well. And at this point, I should say, not all these pictures are from Ted's collection, because I didn't have pictures of all of the things in his collection. So in some cases, I have substituted pictures that I had in my own collection to illustrate what's in the exhibition outside. This to me is one of the treasured items, because these very likely are the first eyewitness pictures of Texas. And as a historian, I value eyewitness pictures as a first-hand source, the same as I would a letter that someone wrote or an article that appeared in a contemporary newspaper. So I look to these images for information as I would any historical primary source. There were, of course, no artists in Texas during the Texas Revolution, although, according to some, there were 21 printers at the Battle of San Jacinto, so there would be no lack of information later. This is, however, a contemporary document, and it is a moving one. I have just received information of the fall of the Alamo and massacre of our countrymen. A very blunt message coming from the committee about the Battle of the Alamo that had just occurred. And he goes on to say a similar thing may have happened to the men in Goliad. This is a fascinating piece to me. It's a document that Santa Anna wrote and signed, asking that a negotiator who's working to negotiate between him and the Texas officials be paid for his services. And Santa Anna has signed it. This is done while he was at the Zoribaba plantation. Not only did he produce a document like that, but there was an artist in Texas at that time whose name was J. Strange. And Mr. Strange went to the plantation and painted Santa Anna's portrait. He also did a portrait of Almonte, who was with Santa Anna. And Stephen F. Austin and Santa Anna both attested to the fact that this portrait was authentic and the best one, they'd seen. Mr. Strange took the portraits to New Orleans, and then he went up the Mississippi River, exhibiting them in cities, finally went to Louisville and exhibited them. They disappear from the historical record as far as I know at that point. And I put this picture up there because I'm wondering if that picture, which appeared shortly after this portrait was done, might have been a copy of that portrait. I have no idea. But the portrait may still be out there somewhere. Santa Anna, of course, had his portrait painted a number of times, but this one coming while he was a prisoner of the Texas officials and before he was released to go back to Mexico still has yet to appear. A fascinating story as far as I'm concerned about Santa Anna's imprisonment at Orizaba. Well, this is one of the pictures that I spent a lot of time dealing with. It's the first picture that is published of a city in Texas, if you can call Austin a city at that time, 1840. The drawing was done by a man named Edward Hull. He was the Texas consul in New Orleans. And he gave the drawing to Mr. Joshua Lowe, pardon me. Joshua Lowe was an engraver in New Orleans, and he produced this picture as the frontispiece for a book on Texas in 1840, An Immigrant's Guide. Joshua Lowe, at the time this book was published, was in the process of moving to Galveston. He opened his print shop in Galveston in 1840 and spent several months in Galveston. There's only one known piece that he printed while he was in Galveston. He obviously didn't find much business, and after a few months he packed up and moved back to New Orleans, and at that point he also disappears from the historical record as far as I've been able to find, so I don't know what happened to Mr. Lowe. This piece, however, is a lithograph. Lowe was an engraver, but this one is produced as a lithograph. I had the piece evaluated by a conservator a number of years ago, and she agreed with me, yes, it does look like an engraving, but it says right there, lithograph, and I would take him at his word, and that's good enough for me. And he wouldn't have put lithograph on there if it weren't a lithograph. So it's the first lithograph of a Texas city that was published, and that's 1840, and it's the frontispiece to An Immigrant's Guide to Texas. At the same time, this book by George Bunnell appeared. Mr. Bunnell was a journalist. He established the newspaper called the Austin Sentinel in the new capital of Texas. He was also an Indian fighter and was involved, I think, in the Mier expedition and was killed in 1842 on that expedition. But he wrote this book on the topography of Texas before he passed away, and you probably made the connection already, Mount Bunnell in Austin, and there's a passage in his book regarding Mount Bunnell, which he calls one of the finest views, one of the finest prospects in nature. This is one of the great treasures of early Texas. Map and Description of Texas by Francis Moore Jr. It's an immigrant's guidebook. It includes a fantastic map of Texas. It's pulled from the original plate of Stephen F. Austin's map of Texas. But it also includes 8 engravings. This is by far the most pictures that anyone would have seen of Texas at that time, and they are done by an eyewitness. I think they're all probably done by William Bissett, but there is a discussion about the first one, the picture of the Alamo, because there are two possible sources. This is Mary Maverick's picture of the Alamo, which was done, I think, about 1837. And on the right, you see William Bollart's copy of Mr. Bissett's drawing of the Alamo. So we know that Bissett did a drawing of the Alamo. The question is, does Bissett's picture look more like Mary Maverick's, or does it look more like Bissett's himself? Well, there's a slight change in perspective that makes it look a bit more like Mary Maverick, but as far as I'm concerned, there might have been another sketch of the Alamo by Mr. Bissett, which would have been used for the book. That's an open question. It's a question that's still under discussion by all the Alamo historians, and they love the discussion. Well, there are 7 other pictures in the book, and they are undoubtedly by Bissett. Bissett was an immigrant to Texas. He came probably as a surveyor. He later was a member of the Texas Santa Fe expedition, and he was captured with that expedition and taken into Mexico, where he was held prisoner, came back through New Orleans and settled in Central Texas. And as far as I know, didn't do any other engravings or art. But this is his picture of San Jose Mission in San Antonio, and this is one of his original drawings, which I show you here so you can compare it with the engraving. So San Jose, this is Espiritu Santo and Concepcion. San Fernando, the cathedral in the center of the city, and then a view of San Antonio itself, and then a scene near Austin, and a picture of the town of Goliad, which he says was formerly La Bahia. Those are the 8 engravings in this wonderful book, and this tells you pictorially far more about Texas than any other source at this time. And of course, it's coupled with a copy of Austin's map. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately in terms of a historian, because this is an extremely rare book. For a collector, very fortunate, I think. So, but a marvelous, marvelous book. At the same time, this man, Charles Hooton, arrived in Galveston in 1841. Now, his book wasn't published until 1847, and I'll explain why. But Mr. Hooton was an Englishman. He was trained as an artist, but he was also more of a journalist. And he had been reading all these immigrant guides about Texas. And he gave up. He came with some members of his family to Texas. He immigrated. And he was looking forward to it. And he said he saw Galveston from afar as they approached the city. And the city was white against the water. He said it was marvelous. It looked like a formidable city. And he said the closer they got, the deterioration began. And by the time they docked in the harbor, he saw that these were wooden shanties in many cases that had been whitewashed and glistened in the sun, but there wasn't much there. And he said, I knew then that I had made a mistake. Well, he stayed in Galveston a few months, contracted malaria while he was there. He was a working journalist, so he went to New Orleans and had a job for a short time at a New Orleans newspaper, and then I think he went to Canada for a few months, and then back to England. And when he got back home, he began writing a series of articles to prevent anyone else from making the mistake that he had made. His articles are, well, Texas is just about the worst place that anyone could arrive at, and he makes that pretty clear. And then he put them all together in this book. He was a bit of an artist, as I said, and he illustrated the book with his own drawings. These are produced in the book as lithographs. This is Galveston, and this may be a self-portrait of him sitting on the ground there, and he's on the Gulf side of Galveston, looking over at the city, which is on the a little line of buildings on the bay side. So that you're looking from the Gulf side toward the bay side. Here he presents settlers' houses on the prairie, and then the bird life of Texas. And this suggests, of course, why Audubon was interested in coming to Texas, because Texas was a flyway, and birds of every description were available in this flyway, which Audubon found out. But as I said, he'd already seen them all in Louisiana. But a picture like that would have enticed him further anyway. Then he pictures the General Hospital. Well, there had been disease, smallpox, malaria in Galveston. It was a tough place, as you would expect, when those diseases were rampant. So the General Hospital is located, of course, away from the rest of the city. And he shows it, of course, isolated, and it looks like one of the figures in the center there has a rifle over his shoulder. It might have been also guarded. He also shows a picture of the graveyard, and to suggest what a terrible place it was. Here's Matilda Houston's comment. She appeared in Galveston in 1844, and I'll talk about her in just a second. But she said, "On my last day at Galveston, I passed near the burying ground, and a sad sight indeed it was. I should not have been aware of its proximity had I not perceived a human skull under my horse's feet. On looking round, I saw many similar relics, and hurried from the spot with a feeling of dismay and horror." Matilda Houston. Well, Miss Houston showed up in Galveston in 1844. She came with her husband. They came on a yacht that was staffed by a doctor and several soldiers. It was armed. Everybody in Texas thought that he was a spy for the British government, because by 1844, talk of annexation in the United States was rife, and the English, of course, wanted to do anything they could to prevent Texas from joining the United States. So they're all thinking that Captain Houston is here as a representative of the British government. He actually said he was thinking of establishing a meatpacking plant in Texas. They stayed for a few weeks, went to New Orleans, came back, and then they left. And when Mrs. Houston got back home, she wrote a book, Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, in 2 volumes, beautiful set on the exhibition outside. The frontispiece to volume 1 is this picture of the harbor in Galveston, and this is the bay, Galveston Bay, looking at the city. And volume 2 frontispiece is this picture of Houston. Yeah, I don't know where that picture came from. There's a passage in her book talking about taking the boat up Buffalo Bayou and having to climb up the bank. Now, if the artist read that passage, he would perhaps think that Houston was a high elevation. Of course, it was a swamp. So this picture is nowhere near reality, though you do see the boat and the high bank of Buffalo Bayou. But here's what I want you to know. Look what happened to these pictures. The Houston picture and the Galveston picture, I'll just show you the Houston picture, begins a trip. This is in the New York Sun in 1845. This is in Germany. This is in Mexico. And this is in France in 1859. Now, these pictures were copied and copied and copied. And by 1859, when the picture appeared in France, these pictures obviously are the pictures that almost anyone would have seen of Texas. This is a close-up of the French picture with a couple of quotations from German immigrants. Hermann Spies was the head of the Adelsverein, the German company that brought immigrants to Texas. He said, "The printing and distribution of such pictures will do more to lure immigrants than newspaper articles." And there were lots of newspaper articles. And one of the members of the Bonn Company, a group of naturalists sent to Texas, said, "Pretty pictures of the colonies which were intended as candy for the immigrants in Germany." Pretty pictures for the immigrants. So two different views there, if you will, of pictures of Texas that were now appearing in magazines and newspapers in Europe. Well, there were other books being published as well. In 1843, Herman Ehrenberg published his memoirs of the Texas Revolution. He was with Fannin at Goliad and escaped. He went back to Germany and wrote his book, which has, by the way, been translated in a new translation and recently published by the Texas State Historical Association. James Crisp spent years working on that project. But Ehrenberg then came back, spent some time in Texas, went to Hawaii and the other islands, and then came back and settled in Arizona and became quite an entrepreneur in Arizona and was murdered, unfortunately, about 1860, and left quite a trail, though, in Arizona. And historians have been following his trail for years until Dr. Crisp finally tells the story in this new publication. But German immigration to Texas was very significant. There are a number of immigration guides published in Germany. The Schoff one is one of the most important ones, but one of the more interesting ones is the one that Prince Karl himself wrote, and I include a translation there. Prince Karl wrote, "The Texan will, because of his own or another's interest, prevaricate truth in 99 cases out of 100. He's very forthright, he's very blunt. It's not necessarily a negative viewpoint, but it's certainly a blunt viewpoint. So Prince Karl had his say as well. And this is just two of the number of German immigrant books that appeared during these years. So there were literally thousands of Germans who were immigrating to Texas. There's an unofficial census of Texas done in 1887, and if I'm not mistaken, the Germans are the largest non-American group in Texas at that time. This is George Wilkins Kendall's book. George Wilkins Kendall was the editor of the New Orleans Picayune, and he was very interested in Texas, covered Texas news in the Picayune all the time. When the Texas Santa Fe expedition was organized, Kendall was on hand. He joined them. He went to New Mexico and was captured with the others and sent to prison in Mexico and came out, as the others did, through New Orleans, and got back home and wrote his account in this 2-volume work on the narrative of the Texan Santa Fe expedition. It also is illustrated, and I show you one. He describes the buffalo hunt, and that's what you see on the right, a buffalo hunt that I don't think he participated in, but he was certainly a witness for it. He also talked, John James Audubon's father-in-law was John Bachman of Charleston, and Bachman was a great naturalist, and he and Kendall were on the same train one day, and Kendall started telling him stories of the Texas prairie, which Bachman then passed on to Audubon, encouraging Audubon to make a Western trip, which he did in the 1840s. And the great story that he told him that caught his attention was the great prairie dog town that they had to cross as they were going across the Panhandle. That prairie dog town, I think you could put together a book of descriptions of that prairie dog town by the various travelers who passed through. Ted has a wonderful collection of material relating to the Miera expedition, including the correspondence. But he also has this book, well-known book by Thomas Jefferson Green, called The Journal of the Texian Expedition Against Mier. And it also is illustrated, and it's illustrated by one of the members of the expedition. Charles McLaughlin was on the expedition, so these pictures are eyewitness accounts of what he saw. And this is a picture of the drawing of the black beans. You can see the Texan troops are lined up, going up to the top to draw out the bean, and they're surrounded, of course, by Mexican soldiers. So an eyewitness account of that famous episode in Texas and in Mexican history. I love this map. It's by William H. Emery. Emery was a member of the Topographical Engineers. He later was in charge of the survey of the Rio Grande from El Paso to Brownsville. After the war with Mexico, they had to survey the new boundary. So he was documenting that, published a 3-volume work, which is famous within itself. But this 1844 map of Texas shows, you see, this is Mexico extending up into Upper California. But if you look at the Rio Grande, the border of Texas goes up to slightly beyond the source of the Rio Grande, touching, as we all know, into Wyoming. So Emery in 1844, a representative of the US government in a sense, does a map showing the Texas boundaries to be what the Texas Congress was claiming. We know that didn't work out, but we got $10 million for giving up our claim to that territory. Now we get to some wonderful images that are familiar to me. I've loved them for a long time. They're not in the exhibit because apparently they wouldn't fit in the cases. But this is Army Portfolio Number 1 by Daniel Powers Whiting. Whiting was with Taylor when he landed at Corpus Christi, and this is a view of the camp at Corpus Christi. Now, I guess that's not showing up. Corpus Christi is on the far right, on the hills there. And you can see Taylor's camp here, and actually the camp is set up. Now, when you pull into Corpus Christi and make a right-hand turn to go down the boulevard, that's where the camp was. There's a park there now that shows where the camp was. So this is an eyewitness account view of Taylor's camp in Corpus Christi when they landed there in 1845. Of course, they proceed down to the border, they get involved in the Battle of Palo Alto, and then they go into Mexico and fight the Battle of Monterey. And Whiting has 4 pictures that relate to the Monterey. Monterey is seen from the housetop. You can see the artist is on the housetop, and he's got this group of people here with, it looks like they're sitting on boulders. Those were added by the lithographer. I guess he thought there needed to be some stuffage in the picture. That would not have been on the rooftop of a house. The picture below is the heights of Monterey from the south. And then, if you've been to Monterey, you probably went to the Bishop's Palace, which is a museum today. This is the Bishop's Palace on the hill, looking across the city of Monterey with the Saddleback Mountain, El Cerro de la Silla, in the background. And then troops marching toward Saltillo, because after the Battle of Monterey, they moved on to Saltillo and then down to the Battle of Buena Vista. Well, that's Army Portfolio Number 1. Will there be a number 2? No. Whiting said the numerous, exaggerated, and spurious illustrations of a cheap character had sated the public curiosity. And so he didn't do number 2 or 3. The commanders thought so much of Whiting's work that they actually gave him release time to do his pictures and to go back to the United States and have them published. But when he got back, he found pictures like this that had, he said, killed the market. So he didn't do any more portfolios. The next one, though, is one of the greatest works of illustration that I think of the 19th century relating to the United States. This is George Wilkins Kendall and Carl Nebel, The War with Mexico Illustrated, published in 1851. Kendall, after his experience in the Santa Fe expedition, of course, now is deeply invested in the history of Texas and in Mexico. And when the war starts, as editor of the New Orleans Picayune, he headed to Mexico. And there were other journalists in New Orleans, Thomas Bangs, for example, who also went to Mexico and were essentially embedded with the Army as they marched into Mexico. So Kendall, after the war is over, wants to write the history of the war. He considers it to be one of the most important books because it's a pivotal moment in the history of the United States. So he's looking for an illustrator, and he runs into Nebel in Mexico City. Nebel had already done a beautiful book of plates on the history of Mexico. So he and Nebel strike a deal, and they go to Paris to produce their book. Now, in the introduction to the book, and the book is, again, too big for the cases, but Kendall's text is on the same size paper, and it's a lengthy history of the war. And he says he's trying to convey why it is so important, because, of course, we wind up adding almost a half of the U.S. territory as a result of the war. Well, he also says that Mr. Nebel visited all the sites of the battles. So these are, in a sense, eyewitness sites. Kendall had the experience of traveling with the Army and of the documents that appeared after the war to know what happened in those battles so he could help Nebel design the troop movement and so forth, and they've done a pretty good job of that. However, this is the Battle of Palo Alto, which is today a national park very near Brownsville. Now, you've probably been to Brownsville. How many of you saw the mountain range? I mean, is this an artist saying, okay, we need some background here? I think there might be more to it than that. Thomas Bangs, who was also a New Orleans journalist, wrote a book, Our Army in Mexico, and he includes this plate. It's the battleground at Palo Alto and a line of trees across the horizon. You know, it was a kind of a mesquite wilderness. And I'm suggesting that Nebel might have seen this plate, because I don't think he visited Palo Alto. Palo Alto was a long way from Mexico City. He saw this plate and thought it was mountains, and so he put mountains in his picture. I'm not sure, that's just an idea, and it's one of the few that suggests that Nebel might not have done it right, because the other views seem to be pretty right on. He follows Taylor's army as they go into northern Mexico, the Battle of Monterrey, the Battle of Buena Vista. At that point, Scott stops Taylor and sends his own army to Veracruz. And so the next pictures document Scott's march from Veracruz into Mexico City, the bombardment of Veracruz, the Battle of Cerro Gordo, the assault at Contreras, Battle of Churubusco. These are just geographical steps toward Monterrey, or toward Mexico City. Molina del Rey, storming of Chapultepec from two different perspectives, General Pillow and General Quitman. And finally, the march into the Zocalo in the heart of Mexico City, Scott's entrance into Mexico. And I've always loved this fellow here picking up a stone to throw at them. If you go to Mexico City today, you can virtually see this scene. On the right, behind you, is the Hotel Majestic. I think this building still exists. It's been remodeled a little bit, but I think it's still there. And of course, the Presidential Palace and the cathedral are still there as well. So you can really see this scene if you go to Mexico today. These works are the finest craftsmen in Europe. The lithographers, they're hand-colored. The hand coloring is wonderful, but the pictures themselves are very well conceived. I have looked at these pictures with a description of the battle, and you can actually follow what's going on in the picture by reading the description of the battle. So Nebel might have done that. Kendall certainly was there to help him, and Kendall was present for several of these battles, so he would have had first-hand information to give to him. So that makes this set, to me, one of the most valuable virtual eyewitnesses, although I don't think the artist was there for everything. He followed up, and he did visit, I think, all the battlegrounds around Mexico City and probably Veracruz when he left the country. but I don't think he went to Palo Alto. Well, of course, then Texas joins the United States, and there's a period of exploration when the American Army and sometimes the topographical engineers are exploring in Texas, and there's some very interesting publications that come out of them. And one of them is this exploration of the Red River by Randolph Marcy. In 1852, Marcy wrote that the source of the Red River was unknown and unexplored, and that for a river that important, that before the war with Mexico was part of an international boundary, should be explored. And his commanders agreed, and so they dispatched him along with his son-in-law, George McClellan, to find the source of the Red River. So he goes into the Texas Panhandle. He has George Shumard with him. Shumard is a geologist, and I think he did all the drawings, and there's some wonderful drawings of the landscape in the book. They're looking for the source of the Red River. Now he first of all went in the summer. Second of all the water in the Panhandle, is brackish, so they were short of water. They probably all had stomach aches. They probably didn't want to prolong the expedition any more than possible. And Marcy, I think, took an easy answer. He went up one of the canyons near the Paladero and said that's the source of the Red River. And that's what Shumard pictures here. And he talks about how when they found this, there's a spring. You can see the spring gushing water. They relaxed. It was cooler there in the shade. And they just sort of, a moment of revelry. And he says, these stupendous escarpments of solid rock rising precipitously from the bed of the river to such a height as for a great portion of the day to exclude the rays of the sun were won away by the base and the time of the action, water and the weather into the most fantastic forms that required but little effort of the imagination to convert into works of art. So he's dreaming a little bit, but he's in a revelry. This is very characteristic of what's going on in American art at the time. When you look at the works of Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, you see them really kind of worshiping nature. And Marcy obviously subscribes to that point of view and sees that in the canyons of the Panhandle. Unfortunately for Marcy, that was not the source of the Red River. He took one branch of the river. He didn't take the main branch. It would be hard to tell during the summer when there's a drought because there wouldn't have been that much water there probably. But the source of the Red River is on the eastern side of the Panhandle or perhaps in New Mexico. It was finally discovered in about 1876. But this book stands as a classic on the Panhandle and his search for the Red River. The book was so interesting that it was actually reprinted in Hungary. And this is that picture of the canyon that was published as a lithograph in Budapest a couple of years later. The Panhandle was pretty thoroughly explored during these years. Marcy's expedition was 1852. In 1855, Lieutenant Whipple, a member of the topographical engineers, led an expedition across the Panhandle as a part of the Pacific Railroad surveys. In 1855, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis had said, we have to have a transcontinental railroad, and he sent 4 expeditions out, 4 different areas of the West to try to find the best railroad route. And Whipple led the expedition across the 35th parallel. The artist with him was Heinrich Mulhausen, and Mulhausen's illustrations appear in the official publication, but after he got back to Germany, Mulhausen also published his memoirs or his journal, and they were translated into English and published in this country. And you see here one of the plates a chromolithograph of a Kiowa Indian camp that he encountered in the Panhandle. And it's very interesting because of the artifacts, how the teepee is decorated. But among the artifacts you see at the bottom there, bottom right, is a human skull and several other things. There's a near copy of this that appears in the official report. The human skull is missing. It has been, well, it has either been edited or Mulhausen added it after he wrote his own memoirs and did his journal. So there's an effort, needless to say, to portray this territory as friendly, not as a place where you're going to encounter human skulls of some of your predecessors. And that was in the official government publications. Another very important survey that occurred in 1856 is Andrew B. Gray's survey searching for a railroad route from Natchez to the Pacific. 1856. What's coming down the pike? Well, of course, the Civil War. But first of all, railroads. Railroads are becoming the almost cause célèbre, if you will, of every area of the country. Where to put the railroads and who gets the first transcontinental railroad. It became a fight between the North and the South. And this expedition, the Gray expedition, represented a group that was trying to build a railroad across the South. Some people even contend that if the railroad had been built, it might have forestalled the Civil War. Probably not, because the problems were too severe, but that is a position that some people find interesting. Gray was a government surveyor. He stopped his work for the government to take on this private expedition. And what you see sideways there is the town of Mesilla, which is in disputed territory between Texas and Mexico. But the artist on the expedition was Carl Suchard from San Antonio, and that's where the expedition sort of starts. And so he catalogs the places as he proceeds. This is Camp May, which was near Fort Mason. Fort Mason was near Fredericksburg. And near Fort, I can't read that one. Oh well, the next fort beyond, beyond Fort May. But then it gets interesting as he gets into West Texas. This is the Guadalupe Mountains, of course, Cathedral Rock, which was by this time documented by John Russell Bartlett and other artists. And on to the Pecos River, and this image of the crossing of the Pecos River, and showing what an obstacle the Pecos River was at that time, particularly when it was running full bank, as shown in the picture. And then the picture of El Paso, which of course was in Chihuahua at that time, because El Paso, Texas, was called Franklin, I think, originally, and it was just a few houses or a ranch at the time this was done. Later it became El Paso, of course, and the old El Paso becomes Ciudad Juarez. But a very important document. Unfortunately, the company went broke. The railroad was not built until well after the Civil War. And railroads again. This is a wonderful little immigrant's guide to South Central Texas. Galveston and Houston competition had grown up at this time, and the Galveston merchants wanted a railroad. The most important city virtually in the country at this point, 1876, that did not have a railroad was San Antonio. So there's a bit of competition to try to get to San Antonio first. The Galveston merchants have the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad, and their goal is to get to San Antonio. And they hire a Galveston journalist named Matthew Wilden to do this little promotional pamphlet, this immigrant's guide, for the territory that they're going to be crossing from Galveston to San Antonio. Now they go around Houston, because they don't want Houston to be a part of their railroad. They go around Houston and then head west, as you can see in the map, and then have a branch that goes up to New Braunfels. So that's the first railroad to arrive in San Antonio. Mr. Wilden is not only a journalist, he's also a bit of an artist, and I think he's responsible for the many pictures of the Texas towns that appear in this book. I think there may be as many as 20 images. Galveston, Gonzales, to San Antonio. And then various scenes. And notice how the scenes all have water in them. In case you heard that Texas is dry, look at all the water. There's plenty of water in South Texas. And there's plenty of views of railroad towns like Flatonia, too. And I have to say that Flatonia still looks a lot like that. There's a nice little museum in Flatonia, too, to give you a glimpse at it. Well, that is my summary of the things that I like in Ted's exhibition. It's a wonderful exhibition. Ted is a wonderful collector, and I have to tell you how important collectors are for scholarship and for the general public. These materials need to be saved, they need to be preserved, they need to be made available, and of course Ted has done all of those things. So Ted, thank you very much, and appreciate it.